When the children vanished in the dead of night, the jungle itself seemed to hold its breath. From the shadows emerged a towering blue-skinned Hulk, his glowing veins pulsing like trapped lightning. Only one ruler dared stand in his way, the unstoppable Blue King Kong. Their first clash shook the earth, but the monster's true plan had only just begun. This is the war where a king fights not for his crown, but for every stolen heartbeat. The night the jungle held its breath. The jungle was alive by nature, always humming, always whispering. But tonight, it was as if the world had been muted. No crickets, no owls, no wind. The moon hung low, swollen and pale, spilling silver light over the ancient fortress of the king. Torches flickered along the walls, their flames bending in a wind that carried no scent. Inside the great hall, the Blue King Kong sat upon his throne. His sapphire-toned fur shimmered in the torchlight, his massive hands resting on the carved stone arms of his seat. His eyes, deep, intelligent, and restless, scanned the shadows. He could feel in his bones something was coming. The first cry. Far below, in the sleeping village, a child stirred. His dreams twisted into something dark. His eyes opened and froze. A figure filled the doorway. He had a duck to enter, his shoulders scraping the frame. His skin was the color of deep ocean, his muscles coiled like steel cables, veins glowing faintly with an electric blue light. His face, unmistakable. Hulk, but not the green fury of legend. This was colder, calculated. The boy's breath caught. The monster reached out. The mother awoke to the sound of her son's gasp. She bolted upright, just in time to see the monster's massive hand close around him. She screamed, lunging forward, but the monster swatted her aside with a single backhand. She hit the wall and crumpled. By the time her scream tore through the night, the monster was gone, swallowed by the jungle's black heart with the child in his grip. The alarm. From the fortress balcony, the Blue King Kong heard it. One scream, then another, then a chorus. He rose from his throne in a single, fluid motion, leapt from the balcony, and landed in the courtyard with a ground-shaking thud. Guards scrambled to arm themselves, but the king didn't wait. He charged through the gates, his massive fists pounding the earth, each stride devouring the distance to the village. When he arrived, chaos reigned. Parents ran through the streets, calling names into the darkness. Doors hung from broken hinges. Beds were empty. The air stank of fear. And there, in the dirt, a trail of crater-like footprints, each one deep enough to hold a man's head. The hunt begins. The king followed without hesitation, crashing into the jungle. Vines whipped at his face, branches snapped under his weight. Somewhere ahead, he could hear it, the heavy, deliberate footsteps of something massive and the muffled cries of children. His mind burned. This was no ordinary predator. This was a challenge, a declaration of war. The clearing. He burst into a moonlit clearing and froze. The blue-skinned Hulk stood there, holding a crude iron cage in one hand. Inside, 3 terrified children huddled together, their eyes wide. The king's roar split the night, a sound so deep it shook leaves from the trees. The monster turned slowly, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he set the cage down and stepped forward. The collision. They met in the center of the clearing like colliding meteors. The king's fist slammed into the monster's jaw, sending a shockwave through the ground. The monster staggered, then lunged, grabbing the king by the throat and slamming him into the dirt. The earth cracked beneath them. The king kicked upward, sending the monster flying into a tree, which exploded into splinters. But the monster was already back on his feet, charging again. Fist met fist, the impact echoing like thunder. The monster's edge. The king was strong, the strongest in his kingdom, but the monster was something else. Every blow he landed felt like it could shatter bone. His speed was unnatural for his size, his strikes precise and brutal. And then the king saw it. The faint blue glow in the monster's veins was pulsing faster, brighter, with every hit. It was as if the fight itself was feeding him. The king's move. The king knew brute force wouldn't be enough. He feinted left, dodged a crushing blow, and lunged for the cage. With one massive hand, he tore the bars apart and scooped the children into his arms. But before he could retreat, the monster was there, blocking his path. They locked eyes, predator and protector. The break. The monster's hand shot forward, gripping the king's forearm with crushing force. The king snarled, twisting free, and swung a fist that caught the monster across the temple. The impact sent the villain staggering back a step, but only a step. The monster's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Then, without warning, he slammed both fists into the ground. The shockwave blasted the king backward, the children tumbling into the undergrowth. In the confusion, the monster snatched two more from the shadows and vanished into the trees. The aftermath. The king gathered the surviving children, his chest heaving. His body ached, his knuckles bled, but his eyes were steady. He turned toward the village, carrying them back through the silent jungle. The night air was heavy, the moon still watching from above. Behind him, the footprints of the monster sank deep into the earth, leading into darkness. The return to the village. The blue King Kong emerged from the jungle, carrying the surviving children in his massive arms. The village was still in chaos, torches flaring, parents crying out names into the night. When they saw him, the crowd surged forward, voices breaking with relief and grief all at once. He set the children down gently, his huge hands trembling with restrained fury. Mothers clutched their little ones. Fathers stood frozen, staring at the empty spaces where others should have been. The king's gaze swept over them, counting, measuring the loss. The air was thick with fear, and under it, something else, shame. The people looked to their king for protection, and tonight, he had not been enough. The wounds of battle, blood, trickled from a cut above his brow. His knuckles were raw, formatted with dirt and sweat. The fight with the blue-skinned Hulk had been short, brutal, and unfinished. He moved to the center of the square, towering over the villagers. Lock your doors. Guard your young. No one leaves the village until I return. His voice was deep, steady, but inside his rage was a storm. The villagers obeyed without question. They knew their king's word was law, and they had seen the look in his eyes. Into the dark again, the king turned and walked back toward the jungle. His massive frame disappeared into the shadows, the ground trembling under each step. The trail was still fresh, deep footprints pressed into the damp earth, branches snapped at shoulder height. The monster was not hiding his path. This was deliberate, a challenge. The king's breathing slowed, his senses sharpening. Every sound, every shift in the wind, every scent carried to him was catalogued. Somewhere ahead, the monster moved. Signs of a hunt. He found the first sign, a scrap of cloth caught on a thorn bush, torn from a child's clothing. A few steps later, a small wooden toy lay in the dirt, its surface smeared with mud. The king's jaw tightened. The monster was leaving a trail, not just to be followed, but to be felt. Every clue was a knife twisting deeper. The river crossing. The trail led to the river, wide, fast, and black under the moonlight. The king waded in, the water swirling around his waist. The current fought him, but he pushed forward, each step deliberate. On the far bank, the footprints continued, but now they were joined by drag marks, the cage. The monster was slowing, burdened by his prize. The ambush. The king moved silently now, his massive frame blending into the shadows. He followed the drag marks until the scent of iron and sweat grew strong. Then movement. A flash of blue between the trees. The king lunged forward, and the ground gave way beneath him. A pit, deep and lined with sharpened stakes. He caught the edge with one hand, his claws digging into the dirt. From above, the blue-skinned Hulk appeared, looking down into the trap. His glowing veins pulsed brighter, his expression unreadable. "You follow well," the monster said, his voice low and heavy. "But you are too slow." He turned and walked away, the sound of the cage dragging behind him. The climb. The king hauled himself out of the pit, his muscles straining. Dirt cascaded down around him, the stakes below glinting in the moonlight. When he stood again, His breathing was heavier, but his resolve was unbroken. He would not be baited into recklessness. Through the stone pass, the trail led into a narrow pass between two cliffs. The walls rose high on either side, the path barely wide enough for the king's shoulders. Halfway through, a boulder crashed down from above, shattering against the ground in front of him. Dust filled the air. The king shielded his face, then pushed forward. Another boulder fell, then another. The monster was trying to slow him, to exhaust him before the real fight. The second confrontation. The pass opened into a wide plateau. The moonlight spilled across the stone, revealing the blue-skinned Hulk standing at the far end, the cage beside him. The two giants faced each other in silence. The wind howled between the cliffs. The king stepped forward. The monster mirrored him. Then they charged. The battle on the plateau. Their fists met with a sound like thunder. The impact sent cracks, spider webbing through the stone beneath them. The king swung a massive right hook. The monster caught it, twisting the king's arm and driving a knee into his ribs. The king grunted, countering with a headbutt that sent the monster staggering back. They circled each other, breathing hard, muscles tense. The monster's glowing veins pulsed faster, brighter. The king's eyes narrowed. He could see the power building, feeding on the fight itself. The push for the cage. The king feinted left, then lunged for the cage. His massive hand closed around the bars, but the monster was there, slamming into him with enough force to lift him off his feet. They crashed to the ground, rolling across the stone. The king's claws raked the monster's shoulder, drawing a line of glowing blue blood. The monster roared, the sound shaking the cliffs, and hurled the king across the plateau. The stalemate. Both giants rose, chests heaving. The king's fur was matted with sweat and dust, his muscles aching. The monster's breathing was steady, his eyes cold. They stood there, neither moving, the cage between them. Then, without a word, the monster lifted the cage and stepped back toward the shadows at the edge of the plateau. The king took a step forward, but stopped. His body screamed for rest, his mind for caution. Charging now would mean losing everything. The withdrawal. The monster disappeared into the darkness, the sound of the cage fading into the night. The king stood alone on the plateau, the wind cold against his skin. He turned back toward the pass, his steps heavy but steady. The jungle waited below, silent as before. The morning after, the first light of dawn crept over the jungle, painting the fortress walls in pale gold. But the beauty of the sunrise was lost on the blue King Kong. He stood on the highest battlement, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the endless green expanse beyond. Below, the village was eerily quiet. No laughter of children, no chatter of morning markets. The air was heavy with grief. The night's wounds were still raw. The king's mind replayed every moment of the battle. The monster's speed, the crushing strength, the glowing veins that seemed to feed on violence. And the sound of the cage dragging away into the dark. The Council of Stone. Inside the fortress, the king summoned his war council. The chamber was lit by shafts of sunlight cutting through narrow windows, dust motes swirling in the air. The elders spoke in hushed tones, their voices trembling. "Majesty, this creature is not of our world," one said. "It cannot be fought with strength alone." The king's deep voice cut through the room. "It bleeds. I saw it. And if it bleeds, it can be broken." The council fell silent. They knew their king's will was unshakable. The preparation. The king left the council and descended into the fortress armory, a cavern of stone and steel. Weapons lined the walls, spears tipped with obsidian, war clubs carved from ironwood, shields reinforced with bronze. He chose none of them. Instead, he took a length of heavy chain, wrapping it around his forearm until it became an extension of his body. The chain would serve not just as a weapon, but as a tether, something to bind the monster if the chance arose. The jungle's edge. By midday, the king stood at the edge of the jungle once more. The air was thick with heat, the canopy above alive with the distant calls of unseen creatures. He stepped forward, the ground trembling under his weight. The trail from the night before was still visible. Deep footprints, broken branches, and here and there, the faint metallic scent of the monster's blood. The signs of struggle. Hours into the pursuit, the king found a clearing where the earth was churned and trees lay splintered. In the center, a crude fire pit still smoldered. Beside it, the cage empty. The king's massive hand closed around one of the bars. It was bent outward, as if something had forced its way free. But there were no signs of the children, no footprints small enough to be theirs. The king's jaw tightened. This was no rescue. This was a relocation. The scent of a monster. The king knelt, pressing his palm to the ground. The scent was strong here, sweat, iron, and something else, something unnatural. He followed it deeper into the jungle, moving with surprising silence for his size. The chain around his arm clinked softly with each step. The ruined temple. The trail led to a place the king had not seen in years. The ruins of an ancient temple, its stone walls swallowed by vines, its statues worn smooth by centuries of rain. The air here was cooler, the shadows deeper. The king stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. And then he saw them, the children. They stood in a line along the far wall, their eyes wide and unblinking. But something was wrong. Their skin was pale, their movements stiff. The king took a step forward, and the children stepped back in perfect unison. From the shadows behind them, the blue-skinned Hulk emerged. His glowing veins pulsed brighter than before, casting an eerie light across the stone. The monster's words. "You came," the monster said, his voice echoing off the walls. "Good. I was hoping you would." The king's fists clenched. "Release them." The monster tilted his head. "They are free, freer than they have ever been. Soon, they will be like me." The king's eyes narrowed. "Not while I breathe." The fight in the temple. The monster moved first, crossing the space between them in a blur. The king swung the chain, the heavy links whistling through the air. It wrapped around the monster's arm, and the king yanked hard, pulling him off balance. They crashed into a pillar, stone cracking under the impact. The monster roared, wrenching the chain free and hurling aside. The king drove forward, fists pounding into the monster's ribs, each blow echoing through the temple. The monster countered with a headbutt that sent the king staggering back. The collapse. The fight shook the ancient structure. Dust rained from the ceiling, cracks spiderwebbed across the walls. The king slammed the monster into another pillar, and this time it gave way. The ceiling above groaned, then collapsed, sending a cascade of stone between them. When the dust cleared, the monster was gone. The children's escape. The king turned to the children. They stood frozen, still staring at him with those unblinking eyes. He approached slowly, lowering himself to their level. "You're safe now," he said. One by one, they blinked, as if waking from a dream. The stiffness left their limbs, and they began to cry, the sound echoing through the ruined temple. The king gathered them close, his massive arms wrapping around them like a shield. The walk back. The journey back to the village was slow. The children clung to him, their small hands gripping his fur. The jungle seemed quieter now, as if watching. When they reached the edge of the trees, the villagers were waiting. Cries of relief filled the air as parents rushed forward to reclaim their children. The king stood apart, watching the reunions. His body ached, his mind replaying the monster's words. The fortress on a guard. Night had fallen again, but this time the fortress was not sleeping. Torches burned along every wall, their flames snapping in the wind. The blue King Kong stood at the main gate, his massive frame casting a shadow that stretched across the courtyard. The children rescued from the ruined temple were safe inside, guarded by the most trusted warriors. Yet the king's mind was not at ease. The blue-skinned Hulk had escaped, and the way he had spoken, the way he had looked at the king, told him this was far from over. The restless king. He paced the battlements, scanning the jungle's edge. Every rustle of leaves, every flicker of movement in the shadows made his muscles tense. The chain he had used in the temple was coiled around his forearm again, heavier now, reinforced with steel spikes. The king was not waiting for the monster to come to him. He was waiting for the moment to strike first. The distraction. A sudden shout rang out from the southern wall. The king turned sharply, leaping down from the battlement in a single bound. A guard pointed toward the tree-line. There, a flicker of blue light, pulsing faintly between the trees. The king's eyes narrowed. It was the same glow he had seen in the monster's veins. Without hesitation, he ordered the gates opened. Into the jungle once more. The king moved fast, his massive strides eating the ground. The glow ahead flickered like a lure, always just far enough to keep him chasing. Branches whipped at his face, roots clawed at his feet, but he didn't slow. The air grew thicker, the sounds of the fortress fading behind him. The clearing of bones. The glow led him to a clearing unlike any he had seen before. The ground was littered with bones, animal and human alike, bleached white under the moonlight. In the center stood the blue-skinned Hulk, his back turned. The glow from his veins lit the bones around him in an eerie blue haze. "You followed," the monster said without turning. The king's voice was low, steady. "I will always follow. The trap springs." The monster turned slowly, his eyes glinting. "Good. Then you can die here." From the shadows, massive shapes emerged. Crude stone golems, each one towering and jagged, their eyes glowing faintly blue. The monster had not come alone. The king's fist clenched. He had fought armies before. He would fight one again. The battle in the bone field. The first golem charged, swinging a stone arm the size of a tree trunk. The king ducked under the blow, driving his fist into its chest. The impact shattered stone, sending shards flying. Another came from behind. The king spun, swinging his chain in a wide arc. The spiked links tore through the golem's neck, its head crashing to the ground. But for every one he broke, two more stepped forward. The monster joins in. The blue-skinned Hulk moved through the chaos like a predator, his strikes precise and devastating. He slammed into the king, driving him back into a pile of bones that shattered under their weight. The king roared, grabbing the monster by the arm and hurling him into one of his own golems. The stone creature crumbled, but the monster was already back on his feet, grinning. The clash of titans. They met in the center of the clearing, fists colliding with bone-shaking force. The ground cracked beneath them, bones splintering underfoot. The king wrapped his chain around the monster's torso, pulling tight. The spikes bit into blue skin, drawing glowing blood. The monster snarled, grabbing the chain and yanking the king forward into a crushing headbutt. Breaking the circle, the golems closed in, forming a ring around the two giants. The king's eyes darted, calculating. He swung the chain in a wide circle, smashing through the nearest golems, creating a gap. He lunged through it, forcing the monster to follow. The fight spilled into the jungle, the sounds of shattering stone fading behind them. The river fight. They crashed through the undergrowth and into the river, water exploding around them. The current pulled at their legs, but neither gave ground. The king drove the monster under the surface, holding him down. The glow from the monster's veins lit the water like lightning. With a surge of strength, the monster broke free, sending the king tumbling backward into the shallows. The final exchange. Both giants rose, water streaming from their bodies. They charged one last time, the impact sending a spray of river water high into the air. The king's fist connected with the monster's jaw. At the same moment, the monster's elbow slammed into the king's ribs. Both staggered back, breathing hard. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the river rushing between them. The withdrawal. Without a word, the blue-skinned Hulk stepped back into the shadows of the jungle. The king did not follow. His body ached, his breath came in ragged bursts, and he knew the fight was not over. But tonight, it was done. He turned and began the long walk back to the fortress, the chain heavy around his arm, the moonlight glinting off the water behind him. The fortress in mourning. The fortress was quieter than it had ever been. Even the wind seemed to move softly, as if afraid to disturb the grief that hung over the stone walls. The Blue King Kong stood in the great hall, his massive frame hunched forward, hands gripping the edge of the war table. Before him lay a crude map of the jungle, marked with stones and carved symbols. Each mark represented a place the blue-skinned Hulk had struck. Each mark was a wound. The king's eyes burned with the memory of the monster's grin, the sound of the cage dragging away into the night. The call to arms. The heavy doors of the hall creaked open. Warriors entered, the strongest of the kingdom, each one armed and armored. They knelt before the king, their heads bowed. One spoke, "Majesty, we are ready to follow you into the heart of the jungle. Wherever the monster hides, we will find him." The king straightened, towering over them. "This is not a hunt," he said. "This is war." The march into the green. By midday, the war party was moving. The king led from the front, his chain coiled around his arm, his steps shaking the earth. Behind him, the warriors moved in silence, their eyes scanning the dense foliage. The jungle swallowed them quickly. Shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy, painting the ground in shifting patterns. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and distant rain. The first sign, hours into the march, they found it, a massive tree, its trunk split clean in half as if struck by a giant's fist. The wood still smoked faintly. The king touched the splintered edge. "He's close." The warriors tightened their grips on their weapons. The ambush, it came without warning. A roar split the air, and from the trees above, massive shapes dropped. More of the stone golems, their jagged forms crashing into the warriors. The king reacted instantly, swinging his chain in a wide arc. The spiked links smashed through stone, sending shards flying. Warriors clashed with the golems, the sound of steel on rock echoing through the jungle. And then, through the chaos, the blue-skinned Hulk appeared. The monster's entrance. He stepped into the clearing, the glow from his veins casting an eerie light across the battle. His eyes locked on the king, and for a moment, the noise of the fight seemed to fade. "Still chasing me," the monster said, his voice low and mocking. "Still running," the king replied. The clash. They met in the center of the clearing with a force that shook the ground. The king's fist slammed into the monster's ribs, the impact sending a shockwave through the air. The monster countered with a crushing blow to the king's jaw, snapping his head back. Around them, the battle raged, warriors breaking golems, golems breaking warriors, but the two giants saw only each other. The struggle for control. The king wrapped his chain around the monster's arm, yanking him forward into a knee strike that drove the air from his lungs. The monster snarled, grabbing the chain and twisting it, pulling the king off balance. They crashed to the ground, rolling through the dirt, each trying to pin the other. The monster's strength was immense, but the king's fury matched it blow for blow. The turning point. A golem lunged toward them, swinging a stone fist. The king shoved the monster into its path, the blow shattering the creature's chest. The monster roared, shoving the king away and hurling the broken golem aside. The king rose, breathing hard. His muscles ached, his vision blurred, but he refused to yield. The monster's retreat. The monster glanced around. The golems were falling, the warriors pressing forward. With a final glare at the king, he stepped back into the shadows of the jungle. The king moved to follow, but a wounded warrior called out. The king turned, and in that moment, the monster was gone. The aftermath. The clearing was littered with shattered stone and broken weapons. The warriors tended to their wounded, their faces grim. The king stood in the center, chest heaving, the chain hanging loose at his side. He had driven the monster back, but the fight was far from over. The return. By nightfall, they returned to the fortress. The gates closed behind them, the torches burning bright against the darkness. The king walked alone to the battlements, looking out over the jungle. Somewhere out there, the blue-skinned Hulk was waiting. The king's hands tightened into fists. This war would end, but not tonight. The storm approaches. The sky over the jungle churned with black clouds, the air heavy with the scent of rain and lightning. From the highest tower of the fortress, the blue King Kong watched the horizon. His massive hands gripped the stone railing, claws digging into the ancient rock. For days, there had been no sign of the blue-skinned Hulk. No footprints, no glow in the trees, no screams in the night. The silence was worse than the attacks. It meant the monster was planning something. The warning. A horn blast shattered the stillness. The king turned sharply. From the southern watchtower, a guard waved frantically, pointing toward the jungle. Through the sheets of rain now falling, the king saw movement. Not one figure, but many. Shapes as tall as trees, moving with unnatural precision. The king's jaw tightened. The monster was not coming alone. The siege begins. The first wave hit the outer wall like a landslide. Stone golems, their jagged bodies slick with rain, slammed into the gates. Behind them, the blue-skinned Hulk strode forward, the glow from his veins cutting through the storm like lightning trapped in flesh. The king roared, the sound rolling across the fortress like thunder. Warriors rushed to the walls, hurling spears and firing arrows, but the golems smashed through the defenses with relentless force. The king enters the fray. The king leapt from the battlements, landing in the courtyard with a ground-shaking crash. His chain was wrapped tight around his arm, the spikes gleaming in the torchlight. The first golem charged. The king swung the chain in a brutal arc, the spiked links tearing through stone. Shards exploded outward, clattering across the wet cobblestones. Another came from the side. The king caught it by the neck, lifting it high before slamming it into the ground hard enough to crack the earth. The monsters advance. Through the chaos, the blue-skinned Hulk moved like a force of nature. He tore through the fortress gates with his bare hands, splintering the massive wooden beams. The king met him in the center of the courtyard. Rain poured down their faces, steam rising from their bodies in the cold air. "You've brought your army," the king growled. "I only need one soldier," the monster replied, stepping closer. "Me." The clash in the rain. They collided with a sound like a mountain breaking. The king's fist slammed into the monster's ribs, the impact sending a shockwave through the rain. The monster countered with a crushing blow to the king's shoulder, forcing him back a step. Around them, warriors fought golems in a desperate struggle, but the battle between the two giants was the storm's true center. The struggle for the wall. The monster drove the king toward the inner wall, each strike pushing him back. The king's heels dug into the wet stone, his muscles straining. With a roar, the king swung the chain, wrapping it around the monster's arm and yanking hard. The monster stumbled forward, and the king drove a knee into his chest, forcing the air from his lungs. The monster's fury. The monster's eyes blazed brighter. He grabbed the chain, ripping it from the king's arm and hurling it aside. Then he slammed both fists into the ground, the shock wave toppling nearby warriors and shattering the cobblestones. The king staggered but held his ground. The turning of the tide. The rain intensified, turning the courtyard into a slick battlefield. The king slipped under the monster's neck swing, driving his shoulder into the villain's midsection and lifting him off his feet. With a roar, the king hurled the monster into a line of golems, the impact shattering them into rubble. The final push. The monster rose slowly, his chest heaving, glowing blood dripping from a cut above his brow. He looked at the king and smiled. Then, without a word, he turned and leapt over the outer wall, disappearing into the storm. The remaining golems followed, retreating into the jungle's darkness. The aftermath. The courtyard was littered with shattered stone and broken weapons. The rain washed the blood and dust into the drains, leaving only the scars on the walls as proof of the battle. The king stood in the center, chest rising and falling, his eyes fixed on the jungle beyond the gates. The fortress still stood. The people were safe for now. The day of reckoning. The sun rose blood-red over the jungle, its light cutting through the mist like a blade. From the fortress walls, the blue King Kong watched the horizon in silence. His massive frame was still, but his eyes burned with a fire that had been building since the first child was taken. This was the day. No more chases. No more retreats. Today, the war would end. The march alone. The king descended from the battlements, passing through the courtyard where warriors stood ready. They expected to march with him, but he raised a hand. "This fight is mine," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "Guard the fortress. Protect the children. If I do not return, you will know why." No one argued. They had seen the look in his eyes, the look of a ruler who had already decided his fate. The path of memories. The king moved through the jungle with purpose, following a trail only he could sense. Every step took him deeper into the monster's territory, a place where the trees grew twisted, the air hung heavy, and the ground was littered with the bones of those who had come before. He passed the clearing where they had first fought, the river where they had clashed in the moonlight, the plateau where the monster had escaped into the shadows. Each place was a scar, and each scar fueled his resolve. The monster's lair. At last, he reached it, a vast cavern mouth carved into the side of a black cliff. The air that poured from it was cold and damp, carrying the faint metallic scent of blood. The king stepped inside. The darkness swallowed him, but his eyes adjusted quickly. The walls were lined with crude carvings, scenes of battles, of children taken, of a figure that could only be the blue-skinned Hulk standing triumphant over fallen foes. And then, from the shadows, the monster emerged. The final meeting. "You came," the monster said, his voice echoing through the cavern. "I told you I would," the king replied. The monster's glowing veins pulsed brighter, casting an eerie light across the stone. "This ends here." "Yes," the king said, stepping forward. "It does." The last battle begins. They collided with a force that shook the cavern walls. The king's fists hammered into the monster's ribs, each blow echoing like a drumbeat. The monster countered with a crushing elbow to the king's jaw, sending him staggering back. The king swung his chain, wrapping it around the monster's leg and yanking hard. The monster fell, but rolled quickly, ripping the chain free and hurling it aside. The fight in the dark. The cavern plunged into deeper shadow as the battle raged. The king used the darkness to his advantage, striking from unexpected angles. The monster's glowing veins betrayed his position, but also lit the way for his devastating counterattacks. They slammed into pillars of stone, shattering them. The ground cracked beneath their feet. Dust and rock rained from the ceiling. The breaking point. The monster caught the king by the throat, lifting him high. "You cannot stop me," he growled. The king's hands closed around the monster's wrists, muscles straining. "I don't need to stop you," he said through clenched teeth. "I just need to end you." With a surge of strength, he twisted free, driving his forehead into the monster's face. The impact sent the villain reeling. The final exchange. Both giants were battered, bleeding, and breathing hard. They circled each other, the air between them thick with heat and dust. The king charged, slamming into the monster with everything he had left. They crashed into the cavern wall, the impact sending cracks racing through the stone. The monster roared, swinging wildly, but the king ducked under the blow and drove his fist into the monster's chest. Once, twice, 3 times, until the glow in his veins began to flicker. The collapse. The cavern shuddered. Rocks began to fall, the ceiling groaning under the strain. The king stepped back, watching as the monster staggered, his glowing veins dimming. With one final roar, the king struck, a crushing blow to the monster's jaw that sent him crashing to the ground. The cavern began to collapse in earnest. The king turned and ran, leaping over fallen stone, dodging crashing pillars. Behind him, the monster lay still as the darkness swallowed him. The return. The king emerged into the daylight, his chest heaving, his fur matted with dust and blood. The jungle was silent again, but this time it was the silence of peace. He made the long walk back to the fortress alone. When the gates opened, the people saw him and knew. No words were spoken. None were needed. The king's vigil. That night, the king stood on the battlements, looking out over the jungle. The storm had passed. The air was clear. He knew the scars of this war would never fade. Not from a land, not from his people, and not from himself. But the children were safe. The monster was gone. And for the first time in many nights, the king allowed himself to breathe.